We probably should get started.
Okay, we can hop in and then I'm going to share my screen and pull up. I'm not sure who set it up, but thanks, Sarah. I see you shaking your head. I'll share in just a moment.
Okay. Well, happy, healthy New Year to everyone.
Yes.
Kimberly, you should be allowed to share.
Okay. And I just saw a message from Cal. She's having some audio troubles, so we'll just keep track of that for her. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so we wanted to touch base on 3 items. One, wrap up the conversation that we had started in our last meeting, really around the sub-area of the form-based code. And then start to have some initial discussions about the mixed residential and industrial district overlays. And really, primarily for us, as we talk about those 2 topics, today is really intended to be focused on getting some input and feedback from you that will really help us tailor those pieces as we move forward. So specific to the form-based code, so there were 2 elements in kind of the applicable to both sub-areas that were added, and we will send out a draft of the updated form-based code after this meeting. But we did add drive-through regulations for drive-through facilities. We did add content that permitted temporary sign regulations. And then we still, the other kind of main outstanding item is the review and approval process. So we do have some new ideas drafted. We're not going to go into detail on those today. We do want to set up a separate meeting with the town, so with Sarah, Doug, and Eric to kind of walk through those. And then once we kind of can finalize those from the town's perspective, we can come back and share that process with the rest of the committee. So as it relates to the drive-through design guidelines, so you will see the detailed regulations when we set up or send out the updated document. But mainly we do want these, even though we are allowing drive-through regulations per our conversation at the last meeting in both the 332 sub-area as well as the mixed-use sub-area, we want to make sure that the character is kind of consistent with the development and the overall design aesthetic that we are hoping to achieve, particularly as it relates to the mixed-use area. So you'll see that the regulations really focus on maintaining a strong street edge, minimizing curb cuts, ensuring safe access for not only the vehicles, but pedestrians that are accessing the building and might be sharing or crossing vehicular access routes, ensuring there's adequate requirements for landscaping to provide buffers to the drive-through facilities, also regulations for lighting treatments, part of those focused on safety, user safety. No stacking allowed on primary or side streets, so you're avoiding kind of those heavy stacking lanes of traffic on primary roadways. At the same time, we want to ensure that there is adequate room for stacking. I don't know if anyone else, there's one in my town, a Dunkin' Donuts. I can vividly picture in my head, definitely not enough stacking allowed on the site. They've squished a Dunkin' Donuts onto a really small site, and as soon as you get 2 cars, it starts interfering with both access to the parking lot and even goes into the roadway. So wanting to ensure, even with these other parameters, that we're allowing adequate room or regulating and requiring adequate room for stacking so it doesn't interfere with all of those other activities is really important. And then particular to the mixed use district, right, where we're really also promoting some level of residential and a really pedestrian oriented environment being the ultimate goal. we want to ensure compatibility with surrounding uses. So those were kind of the key topics that are addressed in the additional regulations for drive-throughs. And again, you'll be able to see kind of the detailed wording of all of these in the updated document. Any initial questions or thoughts on that?
Yeah, just a question. Will these regulations apply to all of the town or only to this one area? Or will they be, unified in some fashion?
These, for the purposes of the form-based code, are only applicable to the 2 sub-areas addressed within the form-based code. If the town decided they liked them, they could certainly apply them broader, but these are intended to be focused on these 2 sub-areas.
Yeah.
I can't hear if there's someone else talking.
Oh, it's my husband. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Make sure no one was asking me a question that I couldn't hear them. Okay. So then, specific to the mixed use development sub area, we started talking a little bit about some of these specific regulations that differ from the bulk and use type regulations within the 332 corridor sub area. So specifically looking at lot dimensions, setbacks, height, building materials, transparency, and signage. And where do we want to specify different regulations than we have on the 332 corridor? So from a lot dimensions perspective, we had talked about minimum and maximum lot dimension requirements. However, wanted to throw something out there for consideration and discussion. So we had talked about a 100-foot minimum and a 400-foot maximum. And then we went in and did a little bit of analysis looking at some of these specific parcels and what are their existing lot width and depth. And my concern with the current requirements, and you can see from these tables, lot widths range from just under 200 to over 1,100 feet. Depths range from 150 up to over 1,000, with a number in the 500 to 700 range. So if there was a comfort level from the group, my thought is we have a minimum lot dimension, but we actually eliminate the maximum. With this current number, and it could be a multiple, even if you raise it to 500, you're going to create a lot of non-conforming parcels within that sub area by having both the minimum and maximum lot dimensions. And if the goal is to create planned developments essentially within this district or allow that to happen, the maximum may not be necessary. So I don't know, Eric or others, if you have specific thoughts on removing a maximum lot depth and width requirement and just keeping it open.
I don't see there being any problem with the lot width. Certainly, I think that when we talked about the lot depth one, we were just talking, or the thought was anyways, that it might help create a more walkable area, right? If it's, or maybe I'm thinking lot width. Yeah, lot width. So that we wouldn't create parcels that are 1,200 or whatever. I think our minimum minimum is 1,200 right now, something like that, or 750. Trying to keep the lot width in line with what we want as far as a walkable block, and certainly no more than that, if that makes sense.
So
it's not
to keep maximums in and determine what that number is, to your point, that would either create, the need for variances for lot size or kind of existing parcels.
assuming they came for some sort of development, which I don't think would be any different than some of the other form-based standards that we put in here for the use, right, for the car dealerships and whatnot. They would be non-conforming.
Yes, but they would be allowed to continue to function, right? The use is a little different than the lot dimensions, right? Because they'd be allowed to continue to function as a car dealership until at some point they changed use. Whereas given the number of vacant lots within parcels within this sub area, any parcel where there's something proposed that wouldn't conform would require a variance. So I think you're creating more opportunity or more instances where variance would be required right off the bat, because we know going in there's handfuls of properties that do not meet these lot dimensions. They exceed the maximum on either depth or width or both.
Giving somebody else a chance, but I'm not tied to it. I think that it'll probably tend to shrink in lot width over time anyways.
So just to clarify, if someone had a large lot, you know, say 800 feet, under the proposed code, they would have to subdivide it into something that was no more than 400 feet of frontage? What would be the correction? To subdivide and create two properties, or just to add an entrance road? Which is it?
Subdivide or request a variance from the lot dimensions.
Kimberly, have you had this conversation with other towns? And what did they do if you have?
We have eliminated maximum lot dimensions in the past in some instances where there were huge variations in parcel sizes, which sometimes, you know, just the range of parcel sizes in districts. It truly, and then there are other instances where we have kept it. It truly is a, you know, how comfortable are you in going in and presenting this to the public? You know, if you were to keep maximums in, you know, how comfortable is the town going in, presenting this to the public, recognizing right off the bat, you've created a dozen non-conforming parcels within a sub area that have no development on them. And in some instances, that's completely okay. And you have the message that supports that, that goes back to your goals of creating, you know, the density of development and the style of development. And it can be clearly stated why, and we can, you know, work on you with that messaging for the public meetings, or, you know, you can eliminate that and you still have your goal and vision for the type of development out there, but it is essentially giving a little more flexibility to those existing property owners.
So Kimberly, I think I hear a lot of silence, but I think part of that is because this is so different than what we traditionally do, especially with the protection in the residential lake district. But we got to remember too, that what we're trying to do is promote greater density in this area in exchange for the protection of those other areas that we talk about. Can you, I guess you showed a map a second ago. Are you talking about, is it just the 4 parcels that you think would be negatively impacted if we do the maximum, or is it more than that?
Yeah, we just picked a handful of parcels to kind of pull the development, you know, to pull the measurements from. Is just a sample, you know, of a cross section of types. So it would be probably a greater number than what is indicated. This again is just a cross section. So essentially the ones in purple with one exception, 3, would meet the current requirements. The ones in blue are not meeting either the width or the depth maximum. You know, they're exceeding the width or depth maximums. But you can see just visually there are a couple other larger parcels that would also fall under that category.
Right. I guess, let me ask you this. How big of an issue do you think it is? Because just kind of looking at this map here, C is already built out. That's Liberty Apartments. A and D, I would suspect that any proposed development would actually combine them and be part of something else. And B already has kind of a separate, I'm just wondering how big of a deal is it really going to be for us?
Yeah, so, you know, let's use D for an example, right? Just thinking about the vision for that property as part of the Uptown Master Plan. So, I mean, truly, it's not actually that big of a deal, in my opinion. Some communities are very opposed to granting variances and going through that process, right? But so, say the property owner of D wanted to come in and he or she had a master plan for that entire parcel that met all of the other regulations, but their lot width and depth exceeded the maximums in the code. They would simply come in, go through the approval process that we set forth, would require a variance to the maximum lot width and depth, would have to go through that process, would have to justify why they deserve the variance. And, you know, in theory, if the town were in agreement with the proposed development and met all the other regulations associated with this code, and it was a non-conforming use created by the adoption of the form-based code, presumably it would be granted, and, you know, you'd go on your merry way with the approval process. So it's not a huge deal, in my opinion, and it could provide some more, keeping it in provides more concrete regulations and understanding of the intent and desire of the town with regards to development.
So is the biggest issue the building coverage, the lot coverage, or the width and depth, in your opinion?
The width and depth, because the lot coverage and the building coverage are going to be, should be non-issues, right? For anyone coming in with a clean slate and looking at a development, they would typically understand what those parameters are up front and build to conform with that. It's more of what's there today that we don't have the ability to change, right? So we have to work within the confines of these existing parcel configurations, and those would be where the biggest issue is, because those are pre-existing.
If I could, would a typical, an outcome here could be someone with a large parcel wants to build it out and lease it out to, say, 3 different companies. And because of this, they would be forced to subdivide it versus simply lease the land to the companies that want to build under the single parcel that exists. Is that a problem that, a typical problem that could arise here?
They could, or again, instead of going through a subdivision process, they could request a variance to the.
Right, but your point is we shouldn't walk into regulations where we know we're creating a whole set of variances which are assumed to be unacceptable, and yet a few of the discussions I think we've had are what I just proposed is probably entirely acceptable if the 3 buildings built conform to all of the other regulations.
Yep. And in some instances, it might be more desirable to subdivide rather than pursue a variance because of because of the odd shapes or just the scale of some of these parcels. It might be easier for some people to subdivide, but may not give you exactly the development that's desired at the same time with the subdivision, right? Because you're then creating separate individual development parcels where, you know, the preferred vision might be something that's more in a master planned vision.
Yeah, I'm okay dropping the maximums, but just, you know, one opinion.
I would think too that we have kind of design requirements or goals as to what a walkable block or something might look like.
Yep.
To where if somebody did come before the boards with a proposal that was in excess of that, they could essentially hold them to a standard of shortening that.
Yep. Okay, this is something we can kind of leave in as a placeholder with kind of a little asterisk and give some additional thought to and reconsider whether we leave it, the maximum in or remove it. Maybe based on further conversations or conversations with the town. Okay, so we did also talk about building setbacks. These were the numbers that we had discussed at our last meeting. So 5-foot minimum really across the board and 20-foot maximum. So giving you some ability to stagger buildings within that setback, but not too extensive of a staggering. So these seem to make sense in our mind. They seem to still work for everyone else. Okay, and then building height, again, this is what we had discussed at the last meeting, 60-foot maximum and 15-foot minimum for building height. And building materials. So we had talked about this quite a bit.
One question, if I could, in regard to the height, I'm assuming that the fire protection district is okay with the 60-foot. In other words, they have equipment that can handle that.
We can confirm that if the town does not have an answer for that, but it's consistent with other building heights within the town. So I would imagine it is not an issue.
And this will be served by the Canandaigua Fire Department, the city fire department, and they have similar sized buildings along the lakefront and Main Street today.
Okay. And then, so building materials, we have added to this list per our discussion in our last meeting. We did add vinyl siding with the caveat that vinyl siding cannot account for more than 40% of the primary building facade, and it must be complemented with natural building materials. So that's something we had talked about at the last meeting. Just want to confirm that specific language and percentage makes sense to folks. And this again would be for the primary building facade. So the facade facing the roadway, or if a corner lot, the primary road and the side road. Anyone have any concerns with that?
No.
I think we had a pretty lengthy discussion on this last time, didn't we?
Yep.
Yeah. So I think there was a lot of thought that went into it. I'm fine with it.
And then window transparency. So we have, because we are allowing, you know, residential buildings within this sub area, unlike 332, or I guess we're not allowing on 332, but less likely that we will have all primary residential buildings. We have identified transparency requirements for commercial mixed-use buildings as well as residential buildings. And you can see the transparency requirements for residential buildings are obviously a bit lower than the commercial and mixed-use buildings, but are consistent with industry standards. Any concerns here?
No.
Okay. And then the last piece, and again, we talked about this, I think, at length at our last meeting as well. So change to the window sign regulation. So signs permitted are still 3 types per building. And for the other permitted signs, you know, we do have the limitations on number per facade. After doing some additional research, and, you know, coming up with some actually really nice examples of window signage, we have rewritten this. So the number of signs is not necessarily being regulated with regards to window signage. Window signage would still count as one of your 3. However, the number is not being regulated. The amount of space that's being occupied by the window sign or signs is what's being regulated. So 50% of the window space or 32 square feet maximum for window signs. And again, that would account for one of the 3 allowable signs. Is everyone comfortable with that?
Yep.
Okay.
I do have one quick question on a monument sign. Can it have one monument sign and then list multiple tenants on the monument sign?
Yes, there are regulations built in for kind of how tenant information can be displayed as well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so that kind of wraps up the outstanding items related to the form-based code. Again, we will send out an updated version so everyone can look through it kind of with a fine-tooth comb. And we will be coordinating with the town to have a follow-up meeting regarding approval process in the very near future. So with that, we will then move on to our remaining zoning pieces. So the mixed residential district. So going back to the proposed zoning map and the district lines, the area in yellow are the areas that were identified for mixed residential. So areas on both the west and east side of Route 332. The area on the east is immediately adjacent to the form-based code mixed use district that we were just talking about. And then also the area north and south of Thomas Road on the west side of Route 332. So again, then if we go back to our Uptown Corridor Master Plan, the vision for these areas in yellow, and this character map is a little different than the boundaries that were ultimately determined for the zoning districts. But the goal and vision for this was to identify areas that provide housing and residential living in Uptown. Generally, these are in the form of single-family detached homes, townhomes, condominiums, and multifamily homes. So in taking kind of a deeper dive into this and then looking at existing regulations within the current zoning for the town, the vision for this area is really not all that different than your current multiple residential district. The one big change between, I think, the vision for this area as defined in the Uptown Master Plan and the existing multiple residence area is the permitted uses. So currently permitted in the multiple residence district is townhouse dwelling units, apartment houses, 2-family dwelling units, and then complementary public uses, public utilities. The one piece missing is the single family dwelling units. So wanted to have an initial conversation kind of regarding that existing district and whether or not it makes sense to add single family dwelling unit structures to that existing district, recognizing it would impact other areas of the town. Or does it still make sense to use that district as a base, but create that second new district that also allows for the addition of single family dwelling units? So recognizing that is the one nuance between what you already have in place and what the vision for this area in Uptown was intended to be. Kind of a broad question, but any thoughts on that?
Will we also permit, like, let's say we have a neighborhood commercial district, which is kind of like smaller scale commercial uses that support residences. It's intended to be in like a more walkable kind of environment built into the residence. Is there an opportunity to add like some small scale commercial uses to the district?
Absolutely. And that would obviously further differentiate it and make it unique from your existing multiple residence district. So if that's a goal and vision, which I think is great and complements that the overarching vision from the Uptown Corridor Master Plan, if everyone is okay with that, we could certainly add and incorporate some small scale neighborhood service and commercial uses within that.
And like religious facilities or public uses, stuff like that, probably too?
Yep, so just like in the multiple residence uses district that you currently have, public uses and public utilities are also permitted, you know, complementary to the permitted uses, and then religious institutions, right, are just kind of permitted across the board generally, so.
This is Cal. I like that idea. I hadn't thought about that before, but I like that idea a lot. I don't know how other people feel, but I think that would be great if we could sort of bake that into this.
Okay, great. Thanks, Cal.
Yeah, I think I would lean towards doing the new one too. I just wonder, you know, because I don't know if we would have time to really consider what adding single family homes to the existing zoning district would do to the rest of the zoning district. Like, I don't know if we could sit here and decide that today anyway.
I mean, I also like that idea of incorporating that small scale service and commercial. Anyone else on the call have any concerns with doing that, or is everyone generally in favor with that concept?
In terms of small scale commercial, it just needs to blend in somehow. You know, I don't think we want a 7-Eleven put in the middle of the area, but if you had a small, you know, grocery or coffee shop on the first floor of a multi-story building, everybody would probably be totally okay with that. So, you know, I think that you got to figure out the words that allow it to fit the character of what you're trying to achieve. Yeah. Just a comment, if we're going to allow 2-family dwellings, I don't know why I would restrict 1 family. They are almost identical in nature and look, and sometimes you look at a 2-family building, you don't even know whether it's single or 2. So do you want apartment buildings or do you want these smaller structures? If you allow 2, I don't know why you'd restrict 1.
Good point.
I would just add that I would be in favor of single family dwellings. I had to step away for a minute, but I'd be in favor of single family dwellings because I could see a developer coming in and doing possibly some single family homes, some apartments, townhomes, possibly even some duplexes.
Okay.
I agree. I think the mixture would be really nice.
Okay. So we will draft.
Tim, this is Michael. Sorry, just a question on that. How then, if you allow it, do you not only encourage, but make sure that that mix happens? So instead of saying, you know, just somebody could come in, and I may not exactly understand what we're going here, but instead of saying, yeah, you know, we can come in and all of a sudden they put in, you know, 60 single family dwellings as opposed to mixed. How do you structure that to avoid that happening?
And that's a good question regarding how strict you want to be on enforcing a mix, right? Because do you want to have it open enough where someone who owns a parcel, right, could just build townhomes, could just build an apartment building, could just build, to your point, single family dwellings, because they're all permitted uses, and you can have them just, you know, be listed that way and they can choose to do what they want. Or we can write in requirements that at least 2 different types of dwelling unit must be incorporated, and we can, you know, can add language around how they work together and are designed integrated. So that's really, I guess, a question for this group is, do you want to disallow in any instance any developer from coming in and doing just one type of residential development?
I mean, Kim, I may be the outlier, but I like the idea of density in this area. So I would want to make sure that we, you know, it's not just, you know, 3rd acre lot or whatever the, you know, minimum requirement is, single family homes throughout this area. I mean, I understand developers have to make a profit on it, but I would love for us to encourage density personally.
And that's another approach we've actually used before, where you set an average density requirement that might not be obtainable from, you know, only single family dwelling units, for example. So therefore, they by default, to meet the density requirements for the district, have to start looking at interspersing the single families with other types of construction as well. That is another approach that has been utilized, without necessarily stating you have to do at least 2 of these types, or however else we could draft the language.
I mean, I'll stop here, but I think whatever we can do to encourage, you know, I like to be more encouraging than restrictive. So if that's something that allows people to be creative with their options, then personally, I'm in favor of that.
Okay.
And just to reiterate, this is the yellow areas on the map, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Only, right?
Yeah.
I agree with what Michael said.
I would agree with that too. If we're looking for density, let's not say so many homes have to be single family, so many have to be townhomes, so many have to be this, that. I would just say density. I would agree with that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we will move forward in that approach and draft the language around this district around kind of density requirements, and we can do a couple hypotheticals on a parcel to see how that would play out.
And I guess the only thought I would have is, I guess we're not trying to figure out what a developer might be thinking, but when we talk about density, I suppose we're talking about enough density that it would make economic sense for a developer, right? So I think we're talking about more dense versus less dense, right?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, and then slide. So additional design criteria, and because this district will essentially be integrated into the existing code structure as opposed to a standalone document like the form-based code, at a minimum, all of the other regulations within the code are going to apply, and there are already, you know, regulations in place for parking, landscaping. Are there any instances where specific to this district, so the yellow mixed residential district, where you would want to have tightened design regulations above and beyond the density requirements, whether for kind of building material, building style, landscaping, buffer requirements. You know, we will look at the areas where the district meets industrial districts and make sure that there's adequate buffering requirements specific to where you have kind of those two different zones. But are there any other specific focus or topic areas you would like us to devote a little more time to in kind of hashing out more refined or more strenuous requirements than are already exist within the town code?
This is probably already a part of it, but, and maybe it's obvious or a silly question, but I mean, this is in the yellow area, so it's, you know, residential seems to be the focus. I mean, just to make sure that there's adequate and plenty of walking areas, and to get from, you know, if it's got interior streets or something, you know, I think when I think of like an apartment complex or something, that there's sidewalks or walkways or whatever to get back to the street. And if there's not already a sidewalk, I can't remember if there is, like, for example, like Thomas Road or whatever, that they would need to put it in.
Okay.
I think Farmington actually has something like that in their zoning, that when you develop a parcel, you have to put sidewalks across your frontage, I believe, which has been somewhat not popular in some cases, but I think it does make some sense.
Yeah, and I mean, we've done it in other areas too, and it's a lot easier to put it in the beginning than to try and go back and put it in later.
Exactly.
Yep. This is Cal. Fairport Parenton has some similar requirements as well in development in terms of sidewalks and buffering and screens and things like that.
What about, I know we have obviously the big Blue Heron Park, but say like the other side over by like Brickyard and Airport, should we require or put it in here or leave it up to the planning board, potential like park space essentially? You know, thinking more like smaller parks that might serve more like the neighborhood, but you know, how do we plan for park spaces with future residential growth in that area?
And Eric, are you referring to new public park space or just green space that would be provided as part of a development plan?
I would imagine public.
So that might be a larger question for the town that goes kind of above and beyond zoning, unless, you know, with agreements on, for any private property, right? If it's going to be a public park, there would have to be other agreements and decisions in place.
Yeah, Kimberly, I mean, and Eric, and I know that's come up with the planning board, but that has not been discussed with the town board. And I guess my question would be, do we really want it? Because we've got Outhouse Park with room for expansion of Outhouse Park. We've got the inclusive playground that we're doing, plus expansion opportunity for that to go beyond that. Plus we've got Old Brookside Park right there, and we've got Blue Heron Park right there, plus all the stuff associated with the Auburn Trail. So don't know, we really haven't had that conversation. We'd have to talk about pros and cons. Is it worth it? Do we want more public parks in that area?
I'm just looking at it from a walkability perspective. They're certainly in the area, and I imagine they would get some use, but roughly, you know, from Airport Road, it might be 6,000 feet or so to Outhouse Park, a few thousand feet, plus crossing 332 to Blue Heron. Anyways. We do have an incentive anyways for developers to provide parkland. You know, if the planning board's willing to waive that $1,000 fee on new units for the Parks and Recreation Fund.
Yeah.
But anyways.
Wouldn't that be something that could be left to the planning board? I mean, they have that discretion now, Eric, to, you know, waive the $1,000, you know, if the developer installs a park. So not knowing what the future holds, leave it at the discretion of the planning board that if the density is such that it looks like it demands something, they could ask that be done and waive the fee.
And then kind of a follow-up is, can you remind me, Kimberly, in this section, is there still that green space requirement for residential?
So we can build that in. We haven't drafted this district yet, but we can, you know, incorporate language that essentially gets to kind of those key points of connections. You know, we do have the requirement for a shared space as part of the form-based code. So we can do something comparable here that's not necessarily fully public space like a designated public park, but it does provide those additional amenities and green space for residents.
Which is often a part of multifamily developments anyway.
Yeah.
Or do we need to require it? I don't know. I like the idea of having, you know, more places, especially if we're going to have more people living there. But again, I kind of agree with what Doug said. Do we want to make it a requirement? Because then it would basically be saying you build this park and then the town's going to take it over kind of thing. I don't know if that's where we want. I don't think that's where we would want to go, but I do like making sure that we don't have, you know, a bunch of houses with no little play spaces.
Yeah, and I know the town of Pittsford has some specific language in their zoning code that essentially requires those smaller, you know, spaces be created as part of any residential development of over 3 homes. So, you know, there are some good examples of language out there that we can pull together and kind of determine what works best and what are folks here most comfortable with when it comes to from a regulatory perspective. Well, why don't we pull together some sample language, and then at our next meeting, we can share that and maybe discuss in a little more detail regarding kind of open space requirements. But it sounds like from a public park perspective, at this point, kind of continue to leave that to the discretion of the planning board and other planning or decisions that might run parallel to this process.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So I think that gives us enough context to kind of start piecing together and pulling together something for the mixed residential district. And then the other primary area that we wanted to oh, go ahead.
Just briefly, on-street parking requirements. We do have on-street allowed in most other areas with the exception of the winter. But, you know, if this is going to be a more walkable area, a bit denser, we should probably have some consideration of whether and how on-street might be accommodated. Just a thought, maybe.
Okay. Let us take a deeper dive into your existing code, and we can give that a little more thought with regards to the on-street parking. Unless anyone has some initial thoughts they want to share kind of right off the bat on what they think is appropriate. Okay, so we'll note that and take a closer look at that as well. Okay, and then with regards to the industrial district. So again, this is intended to be not a new district like the mixed residential. This is intended to be two overlays actually, one for the business park and one for the industrial district. So those are the blue and the purple districts. So the intent is not to touch the underlying district as it relates to permitted uses or any of the existing bulk and use standards that are already identified in your zoning schedule in the existing code. This is intended to kind of float on top of those districts and be another layer of essentially design considerations associated with those areas. So similar to what we were just talking about, really wanted to get your sense and understanding of how far do we want this overlay to go, right? Where do we want to set the bar? What do we want to regulate through this overlay or these two overlays, which may or may not be the same for those two different districts. You know, so things that we could regulate through the overlay, and again, want to have further discussion on these, could be, you know, building materials, transparency requirements, specific building landscape requirements, additional site and parking landscaping, architectural style, and greater focus on signage. So those are all possibilities, not necessarily that all of those want to be regulated, or maybe there's something that's not on this list that has been an issue or identified in the past that you would like us to be considering as part of this overlay. So thinking about materials, we can identify a list of allowable materials, or we can identify a list of materials that aren't permitted. You could stay away from both of those. And as you see in this example, just require that there be some visual interest created on the building by the use of more than one building material is one way to look at this. You know, you can certainly get into a lot of detail on requirements for architectural style, but here again, you see another example of two different building materials. Here you see the entry accentuated through different building materials. And then here, just another example where aside from the transparency, you have one material that's utilized on the building. So there are a couple different approaches we can take to addressing building materials, if that is even a topic that you would like us to touch on and address as part of the overlay design guidelines. And maybe even backing up a step, right, and going back to a conversation we had very early in the process and the difference between guidelines and standards, right? With guidelines being, these are the things we would like you to shoot for, whereas standards are, these are the requirements you must meet. So thinking also about, do we want these overlays to be more guidelines for developers, property owners, or do we want them to be requirements and standards? And maybe that's the first question we should actually think about and address before we get into this. And Eric, I saw you waving your hand.
I was just saying goodbye to Terry before you left.
I'm really excited to weigh in on guidelines and standards.
I'm just curious, Doug, maybe you know, now that Terry's gone, I'm sorry, has like the aesthetics of industrial buildings been like a point of contention or complaint in the past? I'm sure landscaping has definitely come up, but and then even like storing building materials outside, I know has like come up, but that would kind of be regulated under a different section, I would think. So has the aesthetics of industrial buildings come up?
I don't remember it coming up, no. In terms of the view of us, the aesthetics of an industrial building. I mean, There's been some aesthetics relating to some commercial buildings at different points, obviously, especially when they're highly visible and entrance points into the town of Canandaigua at different aspects or different nodes into the town. But I don't remember anybody speaking about anything relative to industrial. No.
This is Michael. I certainly want to find a balance between standards and guidelines, so I don't know what the right answer is, but we have a limited number of parcels, and we're looking at this over a number of years. So I'd love for us to be, maybe not selective is the right word in who's coming into town, but that we maintain an aesthetic and a quality with these limited parcels, particularly as they will continue to be access points for various parts of the community. So I think aesthetics should be a role. I'm not necessarily pushing for standards, but I don't want us to be in a position where we're feeling like we'll just take any piece of construction that we can get.
I agree with Michael, but I also think we need to be flexible. So I would go more for not standards, but guidelines. I mean, we'll be lucky if we get anything.
See, that's where I respectfully disagree. I actually think, I grew up here and then moved away, and now I've come back, and to see that we are now really truly a bedroom community of Rochester, and economic development continues to come this way. And we're not thinking of development over the next 2 years. This might be 10, 15, 20 years. So I actually think we will see more appetite and interest in coming this way. I think you can see that in Victor and Farmington. So not to completely, disregard your opinion, but I guess that's exactly why I think we can be more selective, because that things are moving this way.
Well, and maybe we will get smaller industrial buildings instead of, those like huge FedEx like they have in Farmington. So I'm not sure, but.
So the guideline, a guideline format would certainly allow a bit more flexibility, which I heard at least one person mention, but still provide some parameters, right? Where it's not kind of a free-for-all as it relates to building design aesthetics. So it's still providing some parameters that gives the planning board, something to stand on when they are commenting or providing feedback on proposed applications without being as restrictive as, traditional zoning regulations. So if that context helps at all. It does change the way you draft the language, right? Though, you use words like should to try and urge people to do things, as opposed to, must do certain things. So, certainly wordage we could change as we move forward, but if we have a sense of direction from folks now, we can start to tailor the language in that direction.
Yeah, partly I think that the difficulty is to be specific would end up it's such a diverse area in terms of industrial development. It could be so varied, it would be very difficult to be very prescriptive in what you're going to require. And so using words that are, it should be attractive from the street view, or, there's probably good examples that, as you say, would give the, the planning people some, some basis to support looking for good in architectural design. And yet, I don't know how you would attempt to actually write rules that were requirements, and you can't make vague things requirements because they're vague. So the guidelines become appropriate.
Yeah.
Kimberly,
over time, 10 years from now, good looking buildings are different than they are today.
Yeah, that's true. Kimberly, I was thinking about what you said earlier, that there was different ways to achieve it, and different levels of suggestions or requirements. I do like the idea of what you said, where, you know, they just have to do different materials or use a variety or something. It leaves a lot of options, but does still say you can't build an entire building with corrugated steel, 360 degrees around it, you know?
Yeah.
But they could still use steel and put some brick like this picture. I don't know what's appropriate with standards versus guidelines. I see both sides. You know, we don't want to dissuade people from coming in if it's going to be more complicated, but at the same time, you know, we do want it to be attractive. You know, you're going to drive by these on your way home, or, you know, and it's like Doug had said before, some of these places are seen by people coming and going all the time. And it would be nice if we could somehow make sure that they do look good from the road, or at least don't look terrible.
Okay.
But again, I don't know what's the right thing to do with standards or guidelines.
So why don't we start using the language for guidelines, right? And it's, you know, just a tad bit softer. And then once you have a chance to review them, you can see, it might give folks, you know, that are reviewing it a better sense of whether it's going to meet expectations for what you hope comes in versus whether it does need to get strengthened into more kind of the design standard language.
You know, I just have a piggyback on that I thought of too. The only thing about the guidelines is, I wonder, does that make it harder for the planning board? If we have standards, is that easier for them when they're looking at stuff like this? You know, because is it too subjective just to say that it has to be attractive from the street?
Yeah, and we probably, it would be tighter than that. You know, we would identify guideline language, because that's too subjective for anything that's intended to be regulatory in nature, but we would essentially be able to craft some language that gets to the goal of, okay, let's try and make this building more attractive from the street, without that being kind of the only regulation they have to stand on as they're making their review process. So.
And this is a question really for the group, and since it seems like we're trying to hone in on, you know, we want flexibility, but we also know, you know, you can't leave arbitrary aesthetic, you know, decisions up in the air. So the question is, you know, we agreed in the, you know, the 332 business overlay in a list of materials. What would be the, you know, and some other restrictions with height, et cetera. What would, you know, is the solution to just create a broad list of materials that can be used and start to lay out some of those, you know, under those key categories, to start to give some of those. And that way we might be able to, you know, say, yeah, we don't want corrugated, you know, steel on 100% of the building. We, you know, so I don't know if that's the way to get at this, to give options and ranges, but it seems like, I mean, I agree flexibility is important, but we also can't, you know, write a vague statute that allows people to, you know, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So,
yeah. So that's a good example, I think, that we can draw, like guidelines versus standards, right? So in a guideline document, you might say preferred building materials are, and should be given, you know, the highest level of consideration for use, and you list those materials. Whereas the standards would say, the following materials are allowed on buildings within this district, and would list those buildings. So still providing maybe the same list, it's just how do you want that opening phrase stated? Are you recommending materials you'd like to see and leading them in a direction? Or are we stating explicitly, these are the materials you get to choose from?
We had a pretty wide range of materials even in the mixed use area, which, you know, is pretty like strict. I can't imagine we're going to hold industrial buildings to a higher standard than those ones, correct? I don't know, it just seems kind of funky to me if that were the case it would go in. So I don't know. I feel like we're not going to, the materials isn't going to be an issue. It's more the design beyond that. And if that's the case, I'm not sure how much we want to get into regulating that beyond just saying they want an attractive design and whatnot, and the planning board will work with the applicant on it.
And then that, you know, if it's really about the design and less focus on materials, it goes back to, you know, requiring that variation of materials, requiring that entries are pronounced from the remainder of the building. You know, there's other ways we can get to design that at least takes away some of the subjectivity for the planning board. Okay. So
sorry, I guess my point is I just want to avoid a race to the bottom. We don't have to be, you know, handout needy and take whatever we can get. So I guess that's, you know, so I guess, you know, that's all I'm trying to say is, you know, let's have some sort of aesthetic, let's have some sort of quality product and not just take anything we can get.
Okay, yep, nope, noted. So we will take a stab based on kind of everything we're hearing at addressing these. And then again, we'll for now approach it in a guideline format, and we can easily tweak, you know, words to make it more concrete if that ends up being the direction we want to go. You know, and I guess to that same, in that same vein, you know, also looking at transparency requirements, and here you can see a couple of examples with obviously limited to none transparency, which is a sometimes necessity for industrial type buildings, right? Based on what's happening inside. But there's also ways that you can require, again, portions of the building to the portions maybe facing the roadway or, you know, public parking area to have a little more of that architectural detail built into it that still allows the industrial use to function, right? Is an industrial use behind it in these two example instances where you know, kind of have a stronger entryway component, and then you still have that larger industrial use behind it as well. So those requirements can be built in, and then also recognizing there are uses that may come into these two areas that are more office oriented, right? And do have the potential and opportunity to incorporate a higher level of transparency based on what's happening inside the building and accounting for that as part of the design parameters as well.
Okay.
Also difference in kind of building landscaping requirements. Do you require landscaping around the building? Or do you limit the requirements for landscaping around the building and focus more on the overall site? And I don't know if anyone has any initial thoughts on that.
I like the pictures you showed us of the transparencies. I mean, it definitely seems like the examples you showed would leave room for everyone to meet some sort of minimum, regardless of what they're doing. And with landscaping, I wouldn't want to let go of requirements or for some sort of landscaping. And I think, you know, we have that in other areas of the town, so I don't think that's unfair. I don't know what we would want to do, like right around the building. I'm not familiar with, you know, the needs of industrial developments, but I don't know. Yeah, I wouldn't want to not have any requirements at all. But I, you know, if there's anyone else who has other ideas or experience.
Well, some landscaping would be nice, but maybe if they, you know, if they have a sign out front that they could have landscaping around that.
I mean, I think there's a clear difference between the photos you're showing us, right? And, you know, me personally, I would choose the ones that clearly look better. So if that's, you know, and it also depends on where the facility is I suspect, set on the property, how far it's set back, whether it's just, you know, street frontage or at building level. But to me, there's a clear difference between the photos you're showing, and I would aim towards making sure that we do as much as we can to make sure that they look like the better photos.
Okay. And then the last piece would just have to do with signage and whether the existing signage requirements that are already in the code, you know, if those are adequate and, you know, there have been no issues with signage in these districts to date, then, you know, I would suggest kind of leaving as is. But if there have been any issues or concerns with building signage, site signage within these two areas, this would be an opportunity for us to look at signage a little closer and address maybe any of those historical concerns that exist. But so I don't know if Eric or Sarah or Doug, if there's any kind of issues with signage in these areas that you've dealt with, had to deal with in the past.
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I think when people talk about signs, it's not usually in relation to the industrial district, whether they're for or against, you know, as far as that goes. It's usually along the main roads that people have any issues with it.
Okay. Okay, so this is something we can just kind of fall back on the existing code and not necessarily get into another layer of regulation within the overlay. Okay, so that gives us some guidance too to kind of start working on the overlay design guidelines. And those were the key items that we wanted to just kind of start exploring with you this morning so we can get started on that mixed residential and the overlay requirements. Immediate next steps, you know, we will shortly be sending you an updated form-based code to review with kind of all of the pieces filled in. So the first time you'll see it comprehensively and fully, and then Sarah, Eric, and Doug will, you know, we'll touch base with you to set up another meeting to kind of walk through where we are with a revised process chart and make sure that's addressing needs as well. And that's all we have for this morning.
Thank you.
So Kimberly, are we talking about a meeting the first week in February or another date?
It will probably be later if we want to share drafts of the mixed special and the overlay. I'm not sure we'll be able to get those drafted in the next weeks.
Okay, well then you let us know.
Okay.
When you're ready.
I think, you know, something later in February would work. I'm just not sure the first week would work.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye. Bye, Kim. Thank you.
Thank you.